what is page context attribute, or what we can do by using page context attribute. This we shall see first. Okay, so using page context attributes or using page context at object, we can create a page scope, we can create a request scope, and we can create a session and application scope. Okay, so once I able to create this object, and once I able to get the page context, I can avail request, session, application, and page scope. Okay, and once I get the objects of these scopes, okay, I can able to perform set attribute, read attribute, update attribute, find attributes, and modify attributes. Okay, fine. So let me add a note point. Using page context attribute, using page context attributes, we can, sorry, using page context object, let me call first, because attributes we shall say later on. Using page context object, we can create, we can create page scope, request scope, session scope, and application scope. Application scope attributes. So how to create a page context attribute? So to create a page context attribute, to create a, to create page context attribute, I need to call the method on the page context dot. So here I'll get the page context dot set attribute. And similarly, the way yesterday we have set the values, key and value pair for request, session, and application, here also you can set. So page context dot set attribute of. So set attribute 1, attribute key, and attribute value. So val 1. So in this way you can able to set the attributes. Okay. So what this does actually? This line creates ATTR1, that is attribute 1, as a page scope, as page scope attribute. Page scope attribute means it is visible within the within a JSP page. Within a JSP page. Okay. Now I wish to set the page context attribute for request scope. Request scope only to the specific request. So page context dot set attribute of. So here I'm setting attribute 2. I'm setting here value 2, and let me add one more additional parameter. I need to call page context dot one static field, that is request underscore scope. Request underscore scope. Okay, means that this attribute 2, okay, will be set as a will be set for the request scope only. So this line creates attribute 2 as request scope attribute. So here is page context is a class name, and it has static field. It has static field for request scope. Now, other possible scopes, let's see now. So what are the other possible scopes apart from this request? Other possible scopes. So you can set here, just like how we did for the request scope, page context, request scope already we did. Next, let me add here session scope. Next, let me add here application scope, and let me add here page scope, page scope. So in this way, you can create multiple scopes for the page context attribute. How to modify the existing attribute value? So to modify attribute values, values, I can use same method with a new value. So attribute 1 page context dot set attribute of attribute 1 with a new value. Okay, but this is also in the form of key and value pair. So this modifies the page scope ATTR1 attribute 1 with the new underscore val 1 as value as value. Next up, page context set attribute for attribute 2 value 2, and you can set here the scopes also. Okay, if you want to change from request scope to some other scopes, you can set the scopes here also. Next, here I can add session scope. Session scope. Sorry, this value is in request scope, right? This value is in request scope. So let me keep request scope, and with here let me add new underscore val. Okay. So this modifies the already it's in request scope attribute 2 with a new val 2 as value. I want to read the attribute values. To read attribute values. So how do I read attribute values? So use page context get attributes. You can call the method instead of get set attribute. Simply call the get attribute, and you have to pass here only one parameter, that is attribute name. Okay, this reads this reads this reads page scope of attribute 1 value. Next up, string s1. I want to get the value string s1. I want to get the value, so I'll use this value. So page context dot get attribute of attribute 2, maybe in a some different scope, attribute 3 or attribute 4, any values, or maybe attribute 2. Now attribute 2 in which scope? It's in request scope. So here I can call page context dot request scope context page context dot request scope, and I need to typecast. I have to typecast. Okay, right? Next, how do I remove? Just like yesterday's methods. Tell me. Huh. Page context dot remove attribute of attribute name. Okay. To remove attribute value. Okay. to remove attribute value. Now here I'll call page context. Instead of get, I'll call remove attribute of attribute name. Okay, so this removes page scope ATTR1 attribute with the value Next, I used to remove from some specific scope. So page context dot remove attribute. So give the attribute name, comma, from which scope you want to call page context dot request scope. From which scope you want to remove the attribute. So this removes attribute to from request scope. From request scope. Okay. Next, how do I find the attribute? Whether the attribute exists into the scope or not. To find the attribute, page context dot find attributes of. You can pass here attribute name, attribute 1, 2, 3, whatever the name you want to pass. Okay, string yes, typecast into string of. Okay, if it is available, searches and gives the attribute value in multiple forms. So this searches and gives the attribute value in multiple scope. Okay, fine guys. So so these are the brief information about page context, how to create the page context attributes, what are the possible scopes for the page context attributes, how do I modify, how to read the values, how to remove the attributes, and how to find the attributes. Let's see one of the important interview question, that is, what is the difference between get attribute which takes a single parameter and find attribute, right? Methods.